Hi, a big thank you to Natalie for asking me to do this talk on my very favourite subject, Queen Anne Boleyn. I'm Claire Ridgway, I run the Anne Boleyn Files in Tudor Society, and I've also written several Tudor history books, quite a few of them on the Boleyn family. Now, Anne Boleyn is more known for her dramatic rise and even more dramatic fall. Her relationship with Henry VIII, which had a major impact on England, and the shocking events of May 1536. We don't tend to give a lot of attention to her 3 years as Henry VIII's Queen Consort. As well as fulfilling the usual traditional Queen Consort roles of intercessor and counsellor, Anne Boleyn used her position and influence as Queen Consort to promote poor relief and to help those in need. For Anne, it wasn't just part of her role as Queen Consort, it was an important part of her reformed faith. One of Anne's favourite authors, French reformer Jacques Lefebvre d'Etaples, wrote of the importance of good works. While he believed that good works were not necessary for salvation, he believed that faith without works was not faith, and works without faith were not works. Helping those less fortunate than yourself was an expression of your Christian faith. It was Anne's duty as a Christian. Anne was given a beautiful illuminated manuscript by her brother George Boleyn, Lord Rochford. It was the Ecclesiast. It contained a translation based on Lefebvre's translation of the Old Testament book of Ecclesiastes, as well as a commentary by Johannes Brenz, the German theologian and reformer. Charity was mentioned in Ecclesiastes. Here is Ecclesiastes 11 verses 1 and 2. Be generous. Invest in acts of charity. Charity yields high returns. Don't hoard your goods. Spread them around. Be a blessing to others. This could be your last night. And Anne's copy of the Ecclesiast said, "The court of kings, princes, chancellors, judging places and audiences be the places where one ought to find equity and justice. But, O good Lord, where is there more injustice, more exactions, more oppressions of poor widows and orphans? Where is there more disorder in all manners and more greater company of unjust men than there? Whereas should be but all good order and just people of good and holy example of life." Anne, as Henry VIII's Queen Consort, was in the position to put things in good order, to lead a good and holy example of life, and to help the poor and needy. And she did, with bells on. Martyrologist John Fox, who saw Anne as a Protestant martyr and who was writing in her daughter Queen Elizabeth I's reign, wrote of Anne's charitable giving, saying, "Also how bountiful she was to the poor, passing not only the common example of other queens, but also the revenues almost of her estate, insomuch that the alms which she gave in 3/4 of a year in distribution is summed to the number of 14 or 15,000 pounds, besides the great piece of money which her grace intended to impart into 4 sundry quarters of the realm, as for a stock there to be employed to the behoof of poor artificers and occupiers." George Wyatt, grandson of poet Thomas Wyatt the Elder, wrote of how her hand of bounty passed through the whole land, and agreed with Fox's numbers, writing, "Her ordinary amounted to £1,500 at the least, yearly to be bestowed on the poor. Her provisions of stock for the poor in sundry needy parishes were very great. Out of her privy purse went not a little to like purposes. To scholars in exhibition very much, so as in 3/4 of a year her alms were summed to 14 or 15,000 pounds. However, as historian Eric Ives pointed out, the sum of £14,000 to £15,000, which amounts to around £6 million in today's money, is likely to be an exaggeration, as it was, as Ives states, 12 times larger than the annual surplus on Anne's expenditure. William Latimer, who wrote a treatise on Anne in Elizabeth I's reign, was in a position to know about Anne's work of charity because he was one of her chaplains. He gives a long list of examples of the Queen's generosity. He wrote of how the amount of money in the royal Maundy purposes increased during Anne's time as Queen Consort. He recorded how when she was on royal progress, Anne would give in special commandment to her officers to buy a great quantity of canvas to be made into shirts and smocks and sheets to those of the poor. She instructed her ladies to make shirts, smocks, petticoats and sheets for the poor, and then ordered these to be distributed with gifts of money. And Anne also made sure that pregnant women were given 2 shillings and a pair of sheets. Anne ordered her chaplains to give alms liberally to poor, needy and impotent householders overcharged with children, not having any sustenance, comfort or relief otherwise, and asked them to look out for poor men or women who had petitioned her or her council and who were suffering loss of time and goods to their great hindrance from a delay in their petition being answered. She wanted her chaplains to let her and her council know of these cases so that they could act. Latimer also tells of specific individuals who received help from Queen Anne. A Mrs. Jaskin, who served the Queen and whose husband was Sergeant of the Queen's Pantry. Mr. Jaskin was grievously ill, and not only did Anne grant his wife leave to depart and be with him, she also made sure that his wife had a horse and everything she needed for her journey, and gave her £10 for the journey. Then there was Mr. Ive, who had lost his cattle, almost to his utter undoing. Anne gave his wife a purse with £20 in it, and told her to let her know if the couple needed any further help. Now, £20 in the 1530s is the equivalent of nearly £9,000 in today's money. And back then, it could buy 16 cows, so it was a huge help to Mr. Ive and his wife. As I've mentioned before in my book, The Anne Boleyn Collection 2, in 1535, William Marshall, a man who was enlisted by Thomas Cromwell to draft legislation for poor relief, dedicated this work, The Form and Manner of Subvention or Helping for Poor People, devised and practised in the city of Ypres, to Anne. Marshall wrote, "My very mind, intent and meaning is, by putting of this honourable and charitable provision in mind, to occasion your grace, which at all times is ready to further all goodness, to be a mediatrix and mean unto our most dread sovereign Lord, for the stablishing and practising of the same, if it shall seem so worthy, or of some other, as good or better, such as by his majesty or his most honourable council shall be devised." Historian Maria Dowling points out that it is a telling indication of the distribution of political influence that Marshall, primarily a Cromwell protégé, should consider it more effective to present his work through Anne rather than through his own patron. It shows that Anne had a reputation for being concerned with poor relief, that she had influence over the king, and that she did play a part in the government's decision to provide poor relief. Reformer Thomas Allway, who petitioned Anne Boleyn in 1530 or 1531, seeking her help, wrote that he remembered how many deeds of pity your goodness had done within these few years, and that without respect of any persons, as well to strangers and aliens as to many of this land, as well as to poor as to rich. And went on to say that Anne's Christian mind is everywhere ready to help, succour and comfort them that be afflicted, troubled and vexed. Anne did help aliens, or rather foreigners. She helped reformer and scholar Nicholas Bourbon escape from persecution in France, appointing him to teach her ward Henry Carey. And William Latimer mentions a Mrs. Mary who fled from France and who was also helped by Anne. Finally, we have Anne's concern regarding the dissolution of the monasteries. Although Anne agreed with Thomas Cromwell and her husband the king that abuses in these religious houses needed tackling, she wanted the money from dissolved monasteries to be spent on good causes, education and poor relief, rather than simply disappearing into the royal coffers. She ordered her chaplain, Hugh Latimer, to dissuade the utter subversion of the said houses and to induce the king's grace to the mind to convert them to some better use. Latimer preached in front of the king and based his sermon on Luke 20, verses 9 to 16, the parable of the vineyard. Latimer emphasised that the owner of the vineyard did not destroy the vineyard when the tenants couldn't pay him in fruit. Instead, he commanded it to be farmed and let to others who should, by their industry and husbandry, amend the negligence of the other farmers. In other words, the owner let it be used by others who would do the right thing. Latimer, and Anne through him, was saying that instead of dissolving the monasteries, the king could convert the abbeys and priories to places of study and good letters and to the continual relief of the poor. On Passion Sunday 1536, Anne's almoner John Skipp gave a controversial sermon in which he called on those advising the king to reject the lure of personal gain. He must surely have had Anne's backing to preach this, her blessing, or even been ordered by Anne to do so. Anne clearly felt strongly about this issue. Going back to Ecclesiastes 11, verses 1 and 2, be generous, invest in acts of charity. Charity yields high returns. Don't hoard your goods, spread them around. Be a blessing to others. This could be your last night. Anne followed these verses to the letter. She was generous. She did invest in acts of charity and was generous with the money she had. She was a blessing to those she helped, the poor and those who looked to her for patronage and support. Her last night came just over 3 years after she'd become queen, but she used those few years to make a difference. Thank you for listening to me, and thank you to Natalie for inviting me to do this talk.